You'll want to listen to this interview. Not only listen to it, but take notes. Because Carla Fowler is not only a super smart person, she's someone that you can learn from on how to get results from every interview appearance. You see, Carla is an MD. She's a PhD. She started a coaching business. And there's two things that I'd like you to listen to or listen for in this interview. First of all, her goal. Her goal is not just to get on more interviews. Her goal is to take the methodology, the thoughts that she's had, the experience that she's had in her coaching, and take those to the world, because she realizes she could help so many more people if they just knew about her. Now, second, she's looking to get results from every interview. She doesn't focus on doing more interviews. She focuses on getting more from every interview. The way she's done repurposing and intentionally picked topics to talk about on her podcast is a case study in how coaches and consultants can use podcast interview marketing. So here's Kristen Nolan and Carla Fowler.
Thank you so much, Tom. Carla, welcome today. It's great to have you on the Podcast Interview Marketing Show. Will you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into podcast interview marketing?
Sure. Happy to. And thanks for having me, Kristen. So I am an executive coach. I run a coaching practice called THAXA, and really my focus is working with leaders on how they can use performance science to go after ambitious goals they've set for themselves, deal with all the uncertainty that comes with that, and really feel like they are leveling up their results. And so I've had this practice for 11 years. And really, I came to podcast marketing about, I guess, a year and a half ago. And part of my thought about that was that I had spent the first 10 years of my practice really cultivating and designing my coaching methodology. And that was really my focus, was build a business and really focus on that coaching process and making it as good as it could be. And then really in this next sort of 10 years of my practice, one of the things I was interested in was broadening how far my ideas were accessible to people. So outside of that one-on-one coaching environment, I think there's a lot of things that I talk about with clients that could be useful to other people. And so I was interested in using podcast marketing, both from a standpoint of business development, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but also as a way to really share thought leadership and impact people beyond people I could see face-to-face, one-on-one.
Awesome. I love that. Well, yeah, you and I have been working together for about a year and a half. And so how has podcast guesting become a cornerstone in your long-term strategy for establishing thought leadership and credibility in your industry?
Yeah, well, one of the ways I really think about it is as sort of a heartbeat. So, of course, when I am coaching people, what they come in with is often where we start a conversation. And so podcasting and being a guest on a podcast really lets me have this pulse of getting to take a step back from specific situations, from specific people, and really think about all the ideas from performance science and leadership that may have broader utility, and even how you frame them to be outside of that specific situation. And so for me, one of the things I described it as a heartbeat. And so for me, it's saying this is a practice I do, because when I show up with a new host on a new podcast, my brain has come along and grown for another month, or, I've had the experiences in life that I have had. And so even the talking about the same topics, often we go to a new place in conversation, or I learn about something. And so I really think of it as this practice that develops my ideas, hones them. You get to see sort of what resonates with people, and they get better over time. Like your impact gets better over time. I think the other thing that is a piece of it as a cornerstone, and really viewing it as this kind of practice, is that I think it helps potential clients really understand, like, what is your relevance to right now? So it's a form of social proof. When someone is considering whether or not they want to work with you, some of what they want to know is, what are you thinking about and doing lately? And when you have a recent podcast conversation that's very human, again, it's a conversation. It's not a pitch. They get to hear you interacting with someone. And what are you thinking about lately, right? What's relevant to now? And I've definitely used it as a tool to help people get to know me even before we might have an intro call. Just a very risk-free and also cost-free way to get a sense.
That's awesome. And I've been to your website, THAXA.com, a couple of times. And I know you have the media page where people can go there and listen to all of the podcasts and get a feel for just different topics, different things that you are interested in and things like that. So I think that's definitely a great resource to share with potential clients, just to show your background, what's important and things like that. So I love that. So you've been with us for about 1.5 years, right? A lot of times people will come in and the expectation is, I'm going to go on a podcast on Friday, and maybe Monday or Tuesday, I'm going to start having leads roll in. How do you, what is it that people can expect as they start the process to better understand what it looks like?
That is a great question. And I can speak from my own experience, and it could look different for other people, but I definitely came into this with the idea that, number one, the usefulness of podcasts was going to be much more broad than simply a direct kind of marketing tool. So this idea that I go on a podcast, someone hears it and calls me tomorrow. Can that happen? Absolutely, it can. But often the way people think about and make decisions, in my experience, and I spend a lot of time talking to people about decision making, it isn't always quite as direct as that. It's not always as linear. It often takes, I forget what the stat is on this, but it's over 10 touches for someone to make a decision, particularly an important decision. So not just like what kind of gum I'm going to buy at the grocery store, but like, who do I want to work with as my coaching thought partner, for example?
Yeah, it's a commitment.
And yeah, it is. And so I very much thought of it as, this is going to be a compounding strategy. And I would say my experience has shown that to be true. So the idea is, one podcast is one podcast, but every time you record something, you share your ideas, you share it to a different kind of audience, you share them in a different way, you start to build a media page. What is happening is the impact and influence of your content is going up, but it's going up over time. And someone might need to encounter you a few times before they make that decision. But I have found some indirect ways that actually were probably more powerful even than that direct connection very quickly. And so one of those was having recordings of myself, of these conversations, to actually share with potential clients. So really, if you think within a sales funnel, and as you are qualifying leads or potential customers, I actually have been using podcast guesting as a tool further down that funnel. And I find it's very effective. Even if someone selects to not work with you, often that can be a good decision. And they were able to say, hey, this isn't a good fit. And that is worthwhile as well. But I think both getting to hear you talk with someone else before, just to get a sense of your style, your philosophy, but also that social proof of, hey, someone wanted to interview you, and there was an audience that thought your ideas were worthwhile, is part of how we make decisions as human beings and how we sort of trust the product or the service or the person, really. And so that's one way in which I've very clearly used the tool of podcast marketing successfully. And like the direct thing happens too. But I think it's important to be thinking about, how do you create lots of touches for people out of the podcast? And we didn't even talk about social media content. So we can talk about that too. But just sort of leveraging, not just for that, I speak and someone calls me, but there are so many layers that if you compound on them, make a great, just build into a really wonderful sort of brand presence and build brand visibility.
I love that. Okay, so in going along with the same vein, we'll talk about branding. How do you feel, and how do you ensure that your messaging and talking points align with your overall brand and expertise during the interviews? So when you're speaking, and you're obviously sharing this with potential clients, how do you make sure that, if the host says something that maybe isn't on brand with you, how do you sort of shift that conversation to ensure that you're staying on brand?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. Certainly, I would say the bulk of my experience has been, and kudos to Interview Valet. They did not pay me to say this, but you have matched me with really great hosts. And so I find this happens very rarely. And like, the overwhelming majority of hosts I've talked to are great people. They are interested, they're curious, they show up with energy, and it makes podcast guesting really fun. Okay, but back to your question, there's a couple of different ways to do this. One is to understand that like one podcast is one podcast. And like there are going to be some that are like total winners where you show up and shine, and where the host is on and you are on and you like create some magic together. And then there are shows where like, yeah, the fit might not have been like quite as perfect, but you can still be doing something, you can still be creating something together. And so I think that's one important perspective point. And then I think a second perspective point is it's always okay to disagree on something, and to be able to acknowledge like that's a really interesting point, and like I need to think about that some more, and then you can sometimes transition to something different. I think the last piece is you don't have to get all your points in one show. So I often just lean into where the host's natural instinct is, or like where their interest is, because that's where you're going to have your best conversation. And so if I'm trying to cram in all three of my like top principles of performance, like that, it can feel rushed, and it just, I think isn't as fun to listen to as when you go deep on one of your topics and just say, hey, we don't need to do it all this time. So that's often how I approach that.
Okay. And I love that, because I think you do such a great job of connecting with the host, both before, during, and after the interview. So I think that's something that, in my opinion, I think you're very strong at. And then how do you navigate the balance between sharing your insights and your opinions and promoting your business during podcast interviews without sounding too salesy? How do you make it feel organic, and not that used car salesman approach?
That is a great question. I in my line of business as a coach, and just a lot of what we're talking about on podcasts is performance. It is, how do people do their best work when they're doing challenging things? And I think there is so much of a direct connection between what we want to talk about on the podcasts that are just, it's a little bit of my services on display. And so in that sense, I don't find it too difficult to just lean in there, because ultimately that's why someone would choose to work with me anyways. They want to see like, what is my excitement, or what is my depth of knowledge about a topic? Can I envision having a conversation with this person? And so I haven't found it to be too difficult. I do think it's important to have the perspective. And so maybe I naturally came to this, so it's worth saying out loud, that like even if you were actually having a sales conversation with someone and it wasn't a podcast, nobody wants to be sold to. They want to be educated on the value you have. They want to be educated on how you might solve their problem. They want to make sure you understand their problem and that you asked enough questions to really get them. And so I think what I would say is the same thing that goes well on a podcast, I think is actually true even in actual sales conversations. So in that sense, they're not as far apart as one might think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that human connection, and how you're able to connect with people. And, um, one thing that we've actually talked about recently is the value of video in podcasting as well, right? We're seeing a lot more, podcasts choosing that video component. And I think that makes it a little bit easier to connect, right? Like, so, it's not just hearing your voice, it's seeing your face, it's seeing different things. Are you moving your hands? Are you smiling? Are you engaged, and things like that? So I think that's also a great way to do, further connect with the audience and the host as well. So I love that. So one of the things that we touched on previously was the social media portion of podcast interview marketing. So have you developed specific strategies for maximizing the longevity of each podcast appearance in terms of its contribution to your thought leadership goals? So what is it that you do that maybe you repurpose things or reuse and you touched on this before where you send them to clients as well, but I know you also do some other things behind the scenes. Would you care to share some of that background?
Yeah, certainly. And I don't know that I certainly am not maxing out this, but I can tell you what has been, I think, fairly easy to do and also makes it fun. Making the social media feel kind of meaningful. So one of the things I do is once a podcast is released, I get a transcript of it. I'll either listen to it or I'll get a transcript of it. And what I use it for is to look at it and pull out sort of prompts for posts. And I don't have like a blog or something like this. So mostly right now, I put my ideas up on LinkedIn and Twitter. And so I just look through and I read it, and it kind of prompts an idea that feels useful at, a given moment in time. And so I use it to start to generate either quotes or short posts that then I can put into my schedule of posting. So that's definitely one of the ways that I've been using it. And this year I have, again, like the help of Interview Valet to make that a little easier, have some images and things. So that's kind of a new element that I am trying out and working in. So yeah, that's sort of how I've been thinking about it. And certainly it's a journey. So we'll see where it's at next year.
Awesome. Well, what advice would you give to other service professionals seeking to use podcast interviews as a means to establish themselves as thought leaders and credible voices in their respective industries?
Oh, great question. I think one of the most important things might be to see it as a longer gameplay versus like a short-term win. And that both means you don't have to get on the most famous podcast right away because you're not trying to sort of make it in one shot. But also, it gives you a lot of time to practice the skill of being a guest, like get better at having those conversations, hone your message. So there's a lot of benefits from it. And create that heartbeat for yourself, like something that continually like gets you out into the marketplace, gets you visible. And so I think it's really important to do that. And one of the useful tools could be to actually think about all the ways you might actually use it. And maybe just like you can write down at the top of the page, yes, maybe like a new big client just calls me because they heard a podcast. You can put that down, just put it down. It might happen. But then get into the business of what are actually all of the things that you have way more control over that you can do with this if you are consistently podcasting on some rhythm. And then focus on those and thinking about how you would make the most of it. And I think that would be my advice.
Okay, awesome. Well, I want to make sure that we share how our listeners could find you. I obviously mentioned your website earlier, but what's the best way to reach out to you if they have questions or want to learn more about you?
Excellent. Thanks, Kristen. So my website's at THAXA.com, THAXA, and that is a wonderful place to listen to example podcasts. I mean, just if you're like, yeah, what does that look like? Or I want to learn more about performance science. But also it's a place where you can message me if you're interested in learning more about coaching. And then other places are LinkedIn. is a great place if you just want to follow along and get periodic ideas or thoughts on performance. That is a wonderful place to follow. So I'm at Carla-Fowler.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great conversation, and you've definitely provided our listeners with a lot of value. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
That was a powerful discussion. You see, Carla looks at getting the most results out of every podcast interview, and you can also. Over the last 9 years, our clients have really told us there's 9 specific ways they see results. And I just want to hit those because you can think Carla has gotten most all of these. First, people look at podcasts for better leads that close faster for a higher price. There's also the brand differentiation. What makes you different than all of the other coaches or consultants out there? There's also thought leadership. When people think of the category, you want them to think of you. Some people do it as a launch, either a book or a product. Some people use it as the try before you buy with keynote speaking. Everyone can grow their list, either email or social media, if they use podcast interviews correctly. If you're wanting to launch your own podcast or grow your podcast, hey, being a guest is the best place to find new listeners. Now, there's also referral partners. You think about it. You get on a podcast so that you can talk to the host because they control that audience. That's a great referral partner for you. And finally, we've had some clients that do it just for the backlinks, just to improve their search engine optimization so that they can rank higher on Google. Think about how you could use podcast interview marketing to grow your brand and grow your business. If you'd like to discuss this with us, come back to the website at Interview Valet. Lots of resources there, and we'd love to have a discussion with you to see how you could take your message and get in on the conversation your ideal clients are already listening to.